The battlefield is a graveyard of broken men. The sun hangs low, its light swallowed by smoke rising from the earth. The soil is dark, not with shadow, but with blood, so much that the ground itself seems to breathe with the weight of death. Shields are cracked, swords bent, bodies twisted in unnatural stillness. The air carries the metallic sting of iron, the bitter stench of sweat, and the choking heaviness of ash. Silence has come, but it is not peace. It is the silence after screaming, when voices have been cut short, and the world itself seems to recoil from what it has witnessed. At the center of this ruin, one man still stands. His body is broken, carved open by 17 wounds, each enough to end an ordinary life. His thigh is split, his shoulder torn, his chest pierced, and yet he does not surrender. He moves with the defiance of a beast that refuses to bow, striking until his arms shake with exhaustion, until the dead themselves seem to circle him in reverence. 7 Romans have fallen beneath his blade, and even as he staggers, his eyes burn with a fire the legions cannot extinguish. This is Spartacus, the gladiator who defied an empire, the slave who dared to turn Rome's own weapons against her, the man who chose death over chains. But here, in the dirt of southern Italy, his war has ended. His army lies scattered across 20 kilometers of blood-soaked earth, 60,000 rebels cut down in a single day. Rome has crushed him. Rome has silenced the revolt. Rome has claimed victory. And yet, for Spartacus, death was not the end. Rome was not content to kill the man. They needed to kill the idea of him, to strip away not only his life, but his memory, his dignity, his very place in history. They would make him into something more than a corpse, something grotesque, something unforgettable. Why did they fear him so much? Why did the most powerful empire in the world believe that even in death, Spartacus was dangerous? And what did they do to his body, what spectacle so horrifying, that it would echo through centuries, not as a story of freedom, but as the ultimate warning against it? Welcome to Echoes of Time. If you crave the hidden and terrifying truths of history, subscribe now, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I want to see just how far these echoes travel. He was not born in chains. Spartacus first drew breath in Thrace, a land of rugged mountains and fierce tribes, where war was a way of life and freedom was guarded with blood. His people were hunters and warriors, men who knew the bow, the spear, and the shield long before Rome ever set eyes upon them. But Rome's empire was a machine that ground nations into dust, and Thrace was no exception. Spartacus was captured, torn from his homeland, and reduced to property. Valued less than a horse, stripped of his name, his freedom, his past. He was taken to Capua, to one of Rome's most feared institutions, the Gladiator school. These schools were not temples of glory. They were factories of death. Behind their high stone walls, men were broken down like livestock, reshaped into tools for the amusement of the crowd. The cells were narrow holes carved into the earth, barely large enough to lie down in. The food was just enough to keep muscle on their bones, never enough to satisfy hunger. Starvation became a constant companion, gnawing at the will as much as the body. There was no comfort, no release. The men were forbidden to speak in their own tongues, cut off from the songs of their homelands. Religion was forbidden, love was forbidden, even friendship was crushed beneath the threat of brutal punishment. They were reminded at every turn that they were not men. They were instruments of slaughter, sharpened for Roman pleasure. Every morning, Spartacus was marched into the sand pits with the others. There, under the lash of instructors, they drilled until their muscles screamed. Wooden swords battered against shields until bones cracked. Those who faltered were whipped. Those who disobeyed were executed before their comrades. Their deaths a lesson carved in blood. The message was clear. You are nothing but fodder for the arena. Most men broke under this weight. Some surrendered to despair, their eyes empty long before their bodies fell. Others embraced the cruelty, turning their rage on fellow slaves, hoping to climb a hierarchy built on blood. Rome understood this well. They wanted killers, but killers who obeyed. But Spartacus was different. He endured the whips, the hunger, the silence. He watched and he remembered. He studied the guards as they patrolled, noting when they changed shifts, which doors were locked, which were carelessly left unbarred. He watched the men around him, measuring their strength, their spirit, their willingness to dream of freedom when hope itself had been outlawed. Rome had made a fatal mistake. They had taken a Thracian warrior, trained him in every weapon, hardened him against suffering, and believed they could cage him forever. But in Spartacus, their cruelty had not extinguished the flame. It had only tempered it, sharpening it into something more dangerous than they could imagine. He was waiting for the moment when iron doors would falter, when courage would outweigh fear, when slaves would cease to be tools and rise as men. If you've subscribed, thank you for standing with us, rebels of history. And if you haven't, well, tell me in the comments, why resist? Rome punished rebels, but I promise we won't. The chance came in the summer of 73 BC. 78 gladiators, men trained to kill for the amusement of others, rose against their masters. Armed at first with little more than kitchen knives and improvised clubs, they burst through the gates of Capua. They cut down the guards, seized real weapons, and spilled into the countryside. The world expected their rebellion to collapse within days. Rome had seen slave uprisings before. Ragged mobs fleeing into the hills, hunted down and slaughtered by local militias. But this time was different. This time they followed Spartacus. From the beginning he saw what others did not. Survival meant more than escape. To endure, they had to become a threat so dangerous that Rome would be forced to take them seriously. Spartacus understood the terrain like a hunter. He lured soldiers into narrow passes, struck from the high slopes of Mount Vesuvius, and annihilated entire detachments with ambushes so sudden they seemed to come from the earth itself. The first commander Rome sent treated the revolt as nothing more than a police action. He arrived with 3,000 men, confident he would scatter fugitives with ease. Spartacus turned his arrogance into ruin. Using vines and ropes, the rebels descended cliffs no army dared attempt, falling upon the Romans in a storm of steel. The soldiers were crushed, their weapons seized, their supplies captured. Overnight, the fugitives ceased to look like a rabble. They carried shields, helmets, and swords identical to Rome's own. More slaves flocked to them. Field hands abandoned plows. House servants slipped into the night. Shepherds, miners, and artisans all joined the swelling host. Even free men, outlaws, and the desperate saw opportunity in the chaos. Within weeks, Spartacus commanded not hundreds but tens of thousands. And unlike most leaders of revolt, he understood the art of war. He refused to be trapped in the sieges where Rome's heavy infantry reigned supreme. He kept his army moving, always striking, never cornered. Spies carried word of Roman troop movements across vast distances, slaves hidden in villas and farms whispering secrets into the night. His army lived off the land, stripping supplies from the defeated, feeding better as rebels than they ever had in bondage. Each victory pulled more people into their ranks, each success tightening the noose of fear around Roman society. The psychological shock was immense. For the first time in centuries, Italians felt death approaching from within their own borders. Wealthy citizens abandoned their country estates, retreating behind city walls. Slave markets shuttered, buyers too frightened to trust the bodies they might purchase. Rome's entire economy trembled, its citizens forced to see that the people they had chained were not weak, but many, and now armed. By 72 BC, the rebellion had grown into something unthinkable. 120,000 souls marched under Spartacus's command. Not just warriors, but women, children, craftsmen, and traders. This was no longer a mob. It was a moving society, a living city without walls, shifting across Italy like a storm. In its camps, courts were formed to settle disputes. Forges rang with the sound of armor taking shape, and schools taught letters to those once forbidden to learn. For Rome, the nightmare was no longer rebellion. It was the vision of a new order, slaves no longer slaves, but a people free, self-sufficient, and unbroken. Are you watching this from Rome's old provinces, or somewhere far beyond? Drop your location in the comments. It amazes me how history connects us across continents and centuries. Rome could not ignore him any longer. For 2 years, Spartacus had humiliated their armies, shattered their commanders, and revealed the empire's most terrifying truth, that the foundations of Roman power rested upon millions of slaves who now knew they could fight. The Senate could not afford another defeat. They turned to the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, a figure as ruthless in war as he was in wealth. Crassus did not come with arrogance or underestimation. He came with calculation. 8 full legions, hardened and disciplined, marched under his command. Tens of thousands of men armed with the finest weapons the Republic could muster. But brute force was not his only strategy. Crassus understood that Spartacus's strength was mobility, the ability to appear and vanish, to strike where Rome was weakest. To break him, Crassus would not chase. He would suffocate. Across the southern reaches of Italy, he built walls and trenches stretching for miles, cutting the land itself into a prison. His legions constructed barriers that bled the rebels of food, water, and hope. Every path of escape narrowed until Spartacus and his vast army were caged like animals within their own rebellion. Even the sea offered no salvation, alliances with pirates collapsed, and Rome's ships closed the harbors. Hunger and desperation pressed harder than any sword. Winter of 71 BC brought the endgame. Spartacus, unwilling to watch his people starve behind Roman walls, prepared for one last confrontation. The final battlefield was a bleak expanse of mud and stone, where the full might of Crassus's legions stretched in disciplined lines, shields glinting, spears bristling like an iron forest. Before them, a host of exhausted rebels, men, women, children, stood knowing there would be no retreat. The battle erupted with a fury that shook the earth. Blood turned the ground into blackened mire, screams drowned beneath the clash of steel. Spartacus led from the front, his sword rising and falling, his voice carrying over the roar like a thunderclap. He did not fight to live. He fought to carve a path to Crassus himself, to end the war in a single stroke of defiance. 3 times he hurled himself into the teeth of the Roman line, breaking shields, cutting men down as though the gods themselves had seized his arm. But Rome was endless. The legions closed around him like waves around a rock. Arrows and spears pierced his flesh, one after another. His thigh was torn open, his shoulder ripped apart, his chest punctured deep enough to fell any ordinary man. Yet Spartacus would not fall. With blood pouring down his body, he cut down 7 Romans in his final stand, striking until his limbs gave way. When he finally collapsed, it was not in surrender. His face still bore the snarl of defiance, his dead eyes unbroken by fear. 17 wounds marked his body, each one a testament not to his weakness, but to the sheer terror he inspired. Took an army to kill him. At echoes of time we tell the stories Rome wanted you to forget. The battle ended, but Rome's vengeance had only begun. Across 20 kilometers of Italian countryside, the corpses of Spartacus's followers lay in tangled heaps, 60,000 rebels cut down in a single day. For the survivors, there would be no mercy. 6,000 men were taken alive and condemned to die in the most public and agonizing way Rome knew. Along the Appian Way, the great road from Capua to the gates of Rome itself, crucifixes were raised every 30 meters, each bearing the writhing body of a rebel. For nearly 200 kilometers, travelers moved between walls of human agony, a living corridor of suffering that turned the empire's most traveled highway into a theater of death. It was not execution alone. It was a message carved into flesh and nailed into wood. This is what becomes of those who dream of freedom. The dying lingered for days beneath the sun, their cries echoing through the countryside, their bodies left to rot until the vultures had nothing left to take. But in the midst of this horror, one absence loomed larger than all the crucifixions combined. Spartacus himself was gone. No body lay among the rebels, no corpse had been dragged to a cross. Whispers spread like fire. Had he escaped? Was he still alive, gathering strength in the shadows? Rome panicked at the possibility that even in death, Spartacus might deny them victory. For 3 days, soldiers scoured the land, searching fields, forests, and caves. Rewards were promised for his remains, riches enough to buy a villa in Rome itself. And then, at last, Spartacus returned, but not as a hero carried home by his comrades. His body was delivered to Crassus by the hands of his own soldiers, salted and preserved, as though he were a prize catch dragged from the sea. His 17 wounds, each one carved deep into his flesh, had been locked in time. His face still bore the snarl of his final battle. Crassus saw at once what his enemies feared. Spartacus was more dangerous dead than alive. A corpse could become a shrine, a rallying cry, a monument to defiance. That could not be allowed. But if Spartacus's body could be transformed, not into a symbol of freedom, but into a spectacle of terror, then Rome would not only kill the man, it would kill the very idea of rebellion itself. The embalmers were summoned. They worked not with reverence, but with cold precision. His body was opened at the side, the organs removed, the cavity filled with spices so rare most Romans would never smell them in a lifetime. Cinnamon bark, pepper, dried mint. His skin was stripped of every drop of moisture by salt from Egypt, leaving his muscles rigid, his scars stark against his flesh. Resin was poured into his skull, replacing the brain with hardened amber. His lips were painted with wine and honey to preserve their color. His eyelids were pinned open with bronze wires so that his gaze would follow whoever dared approach. When their work was finished, Spartacus stood again. Not as a man, not even as a corpse, but as something more terrible, a warrior suspended between life and death, his body a weapon wielded by Rome. They placed a gladius in his hand, a shield raised in defiance, his wounds displayed like trophies for all to see. He looked ready to leap back into battle, and that was exactly what Rome wanted. We're halfway through, and the story is only getting darker. If you want more tales like this, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of Time. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing history brought to life across the globe. They carried him to Rome as though he were still a conqueror returning in triumph, but his triumph belonged to his enemies. In the heart of the city, carpenters and engineers built a stage higher than the heads of the crowd, a platform wide enough to hold a single man made into a spectacle. Bronze posts rose at each corner, carved with images of Roman victories over defeated barbarians. And at the center, lit by the pale sun of morning, Spartacus was revealed. He did not lie in defeat. He stood upright, posed with a sword in one hand, the other raised as though bearing a shield. His body gleamed with resin and wax, each scar etched in gruesome clarity, each wound on display as proof of Rome's dominance. His lips retained their color, his hair gleamed with oil, his eyes, held open with bronze wires, seemed to follow every person who dared to look upon him. He was not merely dead. He was made into something that mocked life, a warning too lifelike to dismiss, too terrifying to ignore. The crowds came in waves. Citizens lined the streets before dawn, waiting to climb the steps of the platform. The price of entry was steep, 1 denarius, nearly a day's wage for common laborers. Yet thousands paid, driven by fear, curiosity, or the thrill of witnessing the body of the man who had nearly unmade Rome. By the end of the first week, more than 50,000 had looked upon him. Some gasped, some wept, others crossed themselves in silence, unable to bear the defiant gaze of a corpse that seemed alive. But the citizens were not the true audience. The exhibition was for the slaves. Masters marched their servants in groups, forcing them to study the wounds, to hear the explanations of how each injury had been inflicted, and to understand the futility of rebellion. Field workers were brought from miles away, their feet blistered by the long journey, only to stand beneath the wooden platform and tremble beneath the eyes of their former champion. Children stared until they could no longer meet the gaze of any adult, their hope broken before it could take root. Rome had turned a man's corpse into a school of obedience. When the 7 days in Rome ended, the display did not end with it. His body was packed into a special cart, guarded by soldiers, preserved by embalmers who tended to him daily. Then the tour began. Naples, Pompeii, Brundisium, and countless towns in between, all became theaters of terror. In each city, Carpenters built new platforms, officials repeated the same speeches, and slaves were herded into the streets to witness the fate of Spartacus. Nearly 500,000 people across Italy saw him. 500,000 eyes met the empty stare of a man who had died for freedom, only to be remade into proof that freedom was impossible. The effect was devastating. Fear spread faster than rebellion ever had. In farms and villas, whispers of resistance went silent. Markets reopened as the fear of uprising vanished. Merchants invoked Spartacus's fate as a threat, and debts were repaid out of sheer terror of public humiliation. For 200 years after his death, the Mediterranean knew almost no great slave revolt. Millions of men and women remained in bondage, not because they lacked numbers or anger, but because Rome had shown them the price of defiance. Spartacus had died on the battlefield, but his corpse ruled in chains more effectively than legions ever could. At Echoes of Time, we remind you of the shadows that empires tried to bury. When the long tour of terror was complete, Rome staged its final act. In the Circus Maximus, before 250,000 spectators, Spartacus was burned. His body, once preserved with obsessive care, was reduced to ash in the same arena where countless gladiators had died. The flames consumed him over 3 days of games, the crowd roaring as though his destruction were another spectacle of entertainment. When nothing remained but dust and smoke, his ashes were cast into the Mediterranean Sea. No grave would hold him, no shrine would rise above him. Rome ensured that not even the soil of Italy could claim him. But destroying the body was not enough. Rome understood that memory itself was dangerous. Official historians were instructed to alter the record. Spartacus's victories, his brilliance, his defiance, they were diminished, dismissed as the luck of a barbarian, erased with ink as surely as his flesh had been erased by fire. The man who had outmaneuvered consuls and humbled legions was rewritten as a footnote, a criminal who met his rightful end. Yet even in this erasure, Rome could not hide the truth. They had made his face unforgettable, preserved, wired open, displayed to millions. His defiant stare haunted the imagination long after his body was gone. Parents threatened their disobedient slaves with his name. Merchants invoked his fate as a warning in contracts. Cicero himself confessed in letters that seeing Spartacus had convinced him of Rome's eternal superiority. The propaganda had worked. Spartacus had been turned from a symbol of hope into a weapon of fear. For 2 centuries, the memory of his rebellion lay smothered beneath that fear. Slaves remained silent, uprisings vanished, and the empire thrived on their obedience. Rome had discovered something more powerful than the sword, the theater of terror. They had turned a man into a performance, a corpse into a doctrine, and in doing so had solved what they called the slave problem. Not by granting freedom, but by making freedom itself seem impossible. And yet, even buried beneath lies and ashes, Spartacus's shadow endured. Not as Rome intended, not as a warning against defiance, but as a reminder that even the mightiest empire trembled before a man who refused to kneel. His story survived, carried in whispers, resurrected by later generations, told again and again as proof that the oppressed can rise, and that memory, no matter how Rome tried to erase it, cannot be fully destroyed. Spartacus died fighting for liberty, but in death, his body became Rome's greatest instrument of control. His face followed every slave who dared to imagine freedom. His ashes scattered, yet his gaze lingered, haunting an empire that had tried to silence him forever. This is Echoes of Time. If you felt the weight of this story, subscribe, and let these voices of the past reach you wherever you are. Share in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and let history remind us all that power may burn bodies, but it cannot completely erase the echoes they leave behind.